The loading bar disappeared, and the familiar numbers appeared on the screen. I pulled my chair closer and looked at the stock that had been sitting in my portfolio for months. The current price was much higher than the last time I had checked it before going to the mountains. I looked at my cost basis, opened my transaction history to check again, then returned to the portfolio. The loss that had once made me open my account again was almost gone. A few months earlier, there had been trading sessions when all I wanted was for the price to come back here. I didn't need a profit. I didn't need it to become a good trade. Just getting back the money I had put in and walking away from this position would have been enough to make me feel relieved. Now that price was right in front of me. I opened the sell order window, entered part of my position, then stopped with my hand on the mouse. If I sold everything, the story that had lasted for months could end right here. But the price had risen quite a bit while I wasn't watching it. If I sold everything and the stock kept going up, I wouldn't have any of the position left. I sent the sell order. The execution notice appeared shortly afterward. Part of the position disappeared from my portfolio, while the rest remained on the screen. I looked at the cash that had just returned to my account, then at the shares I was still holding. The heaviness that had followed this position for months eased noticeably. A coworker walked over to my desk carrying a stack of documents. I minimized the trading window, brought up the work file, and went through the things that needed to be handled with him. Several tasks that had piled up while I was away quickly filled the screen. One of them was a trip to the factory to inspect a few items everyone had already arranged. When my coworker left, I opened the price board again. The stock had moved a little higher than the price where I had just sold. The difference wasn't much, but I still scrolled down and looked at the order that had just been filled before closing the window. Work continued until the sunlight outside the windows began to fade. The windows of the buildings across from me lit up one by one. Only the documents I needed to take with me remained on the desk. I checked a few pages again, put everything into my bag, and shut down. The two kids were already sitting at the dinner table when I got home. My wife put another dish on the table and asked whether everything was ready for the factory trip. I looked at the document bag I had just placed near the door and told her I had prepared everything I needed. And I pulled out a chair, sat beside the kids, and listened as they competed to tell me what had happened at school. The conversation quickly moved from one thing to another. My phone stayed in my pocket. I didn't open the price board again. Before going to bed, I placed the documents and my car keys on the table near the door. The living room light was the last one to go out. The sounds in the house gradually faded away. Before the first rays of sunlight had even made it through the curtains, the alarm went off. I got out of bed, changed my clothes, and walked outside. The documents and car keys were still exactly where I had left them the night before. I picked them up and closed the door behind me. The documents were on the passenger seat as I drove out of the neighborhood. A coworker waiting at a meeting point ahead got into the car. As he fastened his seat belt, he went over the things we needed to inspect when we arrived. The rows of buildings along the road gradually thinned out. I listened as he talked about the work, occasionally asked about a detail, then watched the factory gate appear at the end of the road. Inside, the sound of machinery quickly filled space. I walked with everyone through rows of operating equipment, sometimes stopping to inspect something, sometimes opening the documents to compare what we were seeing with the numbers we had prepared earlier. My phone stayed in my pocket throughout the discussions. When the group stepped outside to wait for another department to bring some documents, I finally took out my phone and replied to a few work messages. The trading app was right below them. I opened it. The price had moved above my cost basis. The shares I still held were now showing a profit. I looked at the green number, then scrolled down to my transaction history. The price where I had sold in the previous session was now below the current price. Someone from the factory came outside and called for us. I locked the screen, picked up the documents, and followed him. The work continued through several more areas, but the number I had just seen occasionally returned to my mind. When everyone finished the inspection and stepped outside again, I took out my phone one more time. The price was still above my cost basis. The profit on the remaining shares was larger than when I had last checked. A few months earlier, all I had wanted was to get out of this position without losing money. Now the loss was gone. The shares I still held were even showing a profit. But if the price turned back down, the profit that had just appeared could disappear with it. I opened the sell order window, entered another portion of the position, and sent the order. The execution notice appeared. The position became a little smaller. The cash balance increased, and some shares still remained in the portfolio. A coworker calling from the parking area made me lock my phone and follow everyone outside. Trucks kept crossing the dry yard, leaving a thin layer of dust behind them. When we reached the car, I noticed that the body was already clearly covered in dust. I wiped my hand near the door handle, leaving a clean streak, then opened the door for my coworker. He looked through the windshield and laughed. Looks like the car would need a wash after this trip. I looked at the dust covering the glass too, then started the engine. The car left the factory gate. My phone sat in the compartment beside me, and in my account, 2 portions of the position had now been sold at 2 different prices. When I got home, the car was still covered in dust under the light outside the house. I took out my document bag, locked the car, and brushed a streak of dust from my sleeve. The car would have to stay like that for now. Inside the house, I could still hear the 2 kids in the living room. I walked in, put down my bag, and closed the door behind me. The stories from the day gradually gave way to dinner, a few things that still needed to be done around the house, and then the sound of bedroom doors closing one by one. The sun was already above the rooftops when I went back out to the car. The dust from the factory trip was still covering the windshield and both sides of the car. I used the wipers to clear the front glass, then drove out onto the road. The car wash was already getting busy. An attendant took the keys, drove the car into an open spot, and pulled over the hose. A high-pressure stream of water swept across the door, tearing the dust from the previous day down onto the ground in gray. I sat down in the waiting area and replied to a few messages. When there were no more notifications on the screen, my fingers stopped over the trading app. The price had gone up again. I looked at the number once more, and scrolled down to my transaction history. Both prices where I had sold were now below the current price. I calculated the difference in my head, imagining how much more those shares would be worth if they were still in my account. And I returned to the portfolio. Outside, the water washed the last of the foam from the windshield. The attendant switched to a large towel and began wiping the car from the roof down to the doors. I opened the sell order window and entered another portion of the shares I still held. If I sold more now, the result of this position would already be much better than anything I had hoped for when the price was still far below my cost basis. My fingers stopped near the confirm button. A new price tick. I looked again at the number of shares I was about to sell. If the stock kept going, there wouldn't be much left after this sale. I waited a few more seconds. Then I deleted the quantity I had entered and closed the order window. The attendant moved to the other side of the car. I put my phone down, but before he had even finished, the screen was back in my hand. The price moved another few ticks. Both of my previous sell orders were still below the price shown in my portfolio. What if I held on a little longer? The attendant called me to pick up the car. I looked up, paid, took back the keys, and got into the driver's seat. I placed the phone in the compartment beside me. The screen went dark as the car began moving. The previous 2 times, I had sold. This time, I had closed the order window without sending the order. I drove out of the car wash and joined the traffic that was getting heavier ahead. Another question began following me on the way back to the office. If I had decided to keep the shares that remained, I needed to know how far I was going to hold them. By the time I entered the parking lot, the sun was higher. I turned off the engine, picked up my phone and keys, and walked into the building. The question temporarily gave way to conversations, emails, and the work waiting on my desk. For the rest of the day, I didn't open the sell order window again. From time to time, the price board appeared behind my work window. The stock was still holding around the higher price range. Each time I saw it, the question from that morning came back. By the time the windows outside began to light up, I saved the last of my work and shut down the computer. The freshly washed car sat in the parking lot, its paint reflecting the lights as I opened the door and got in. The kids were already home when I returned. One was doing homework. The other was busy with a few things on the table. I changed my clothes and sat beside them, looking over a few exercises before the family moved on to dinner. My phone stayed on the shelf the entire time. Only after the kids had put away their books did I return to the study. I opened the laptop to the work I still hadn't finished. I handled a few more things, sent one last file, then picked up my phone. The stock was still holding around the higher price range. But this time, I didn't open the sell order window. The question that had followed me since I left the car wash was still there. If I kept holding, how far would I hold? I opened the information I had saved about the company and went back through the reports and notes I had used when I first decided to buy. Some of the numbers had changed over the past few months. Some things had not happened the way I had expected, but some results were also better than they had been when the stock was still deeply down. I pulled the computer closer. I entered the numbers one by one, changed an assumption, and calculated again. The first result appeared. I checked it once more before trying a more conservative case. A price range began to become clearer. I looked at the current price on my phone, and at the result I had just calculated. There was still some distance between them. If the company continued along the path I was seeing, that price would give me a stopping point for the shares I still held. I wrote the price range in the margin of my notebook. The door opened. One of the kids peeked inside and asked if I was finished working yet. I looked at the documents on the screen, saved what I had been working on, then closed the laptop. In the living room, I took down the guitar. The kids sat nearby, occasionally interrupting while I played to ask for a part they liked. The notebook remained on the desk, with the number I had just written in the margin. As I passed the study before turning off the lights, I saw that number one more time. This time, I knew where I wanted to sell. The light in the room went out. The last sounds in the house gradually faded until only the sound of cars from the road outside remained. Before the first rays of sunlight had even made it through the curtains, the alarm went off. I got out of bed, changed my clothes, and prepared the things I needed to take with. By the time I left the house, the kids were still asleep. The sound of a rolling shutter being pulled open echoed as I stood outside a familiar store. Inside, the staff were moving newly delivered boxes against the wall. I walked through the narrow path between the boxes to meet the person waiting inside. We started talking right away. I looked at a few product samples, asked about prices and delivery times, then used my phone to note down the information I needed. While the employee went into the storeroom to check on an item that was missing, the screen lit up with a notification from the trading app. I opened my portfolio. The price was higher again. The profit on the shares I still held continued to grow. I looked at the current price, then opened the photo I had taken of the note in my notebook. The target was still there. It was still some distance above the current price, but the gap between the two numbers had become smaller. I opened the calculator on my phone, entered the target, and multiplied it by the number of shares I still held. The number that appeared was larger than the profit I already had. If the price reached that level, I would sell. Footsteps came from the storeroom. I turned off the screen as the employee brought the item out and placed it on the table. Then we continued our conversation. By the time the work was finished, almost all the boxes outside had been moved to inside. I said goodbye and stepped back onto the street. The sun was already high. Traffic ahead was heavier than when I had arrived. My phone stayed in my pocket, but the number I had just calculated still returned to my mind from time to time. The rest of the day carried me from one place to another until the sunlight over the rooftops began to soften. When I got home, I could already hear the kids inside as soon as I opened the door. One told me about something that had happened in class. The other pulled my hand, wanting to show me something they had just made. I put my phone on the shelf and sat down beside them. The number on the price board temporarily disappeared among their stories, dinner, and the familiar things that needed to be done around the house. Only after the kids went back to their schoolwork did I walk into the study. The notebook was still exactly where I had left it. I opened it, placed my phone beside it, and looked again at the target I had written down. The closing price was still below that level, but the shares I still held now had a profit I could never have imagined a few months earlier. I checked the numbers I had used to calculate the target. Nothing had changed enough to make me revise it. And I didn't raise the target just because the stock had gone through a series of rising sessions. If the price reached that level, I would sell the rest. I put down the pen and looked at a few months earlier, all I had wanted was to get back to where I was standing now. Not everything had gone far beyond what I had expected. It was more than I had ever imagined. On the page, the target was still there. I looked at the number one more time, then closed the notebook. From the living room, I could still hear the kids. The phone screen beside me had gone dark at some point, and because of that, the market was about to prepare another valuable lesson for me.